There's a certain kind of quiet that doesn't feel like silence. It's not the absence of sound. It's the absence of the next sentence. For a long time, words arrived automatically. A steady stream of language in the background of experience. Naming, labeling, comparing, explaining. Even when nothing was being spoken out loud, there was usually speech happening inside. A subtle narration. And because it was constant, it felt normal. Felt like thinking. Felt like being a person. But as the inner narrator continues to loosen, there are moments when the words don't arrive. Not because they're blocked. Not because you're forcing quiet. They simply don't show up. And what's left is something surprisingly stable. First, it can feel like a gap. Pause where language should be. The mind might reach for the next word, for the next thought, for the next description. But nothing comes. And the moment continues anyway. This is where many people assume something is missing, because we've been trained to equate language with awareness. If there are no words, am I still conscious? If I'm not narrating, am I still present? But presence doesn't depend on language. It never did. What remains when words stop arriving is not blankness. It's contact, direct contact with what is. Sensation remains. Sound remains. Vision remains. Emotion remains. Movement remains. The body doesn't require narration to exist. The moment doesn't require description to unfold. It unfolds on its own. And you're in it whether or not you speak internally about it. At first, this can feel almost too simple. Because without words, there's no storyline, no interpretation, no sense of progress. The mind has relied on language to structure experience. Language created a sense of sequence. This happened, then this happened, and here's what it means. Without that sequencing, experience becomes more like a field. Not a story, not a timeline, a field of sensation and movement. This can feel unfamiliar, but it's also deeply natural. Children live closer to this before language fully takes over. Animals live in this continuously, and the human nervous system is built for it. We only lost touch with it because we became dependent on explanation. When words stop arriving, a few things become obvious. First, the body is already oriented. You don't need to say, "I am here," to be here. You don't need to describe your surroundings to know them. You don't need to name what you're feeling to feel it. Experience doesn't wait for language. Second, identity becomes quieter. Much of identity is made of words, self-concepts, labels, roles, stories about what you are. When words pause, identity pauses with them. Not in a frightening way, in a relieving way. You don't have to be anyone for a moment. You don't have to maintain a self-image. You don't have to explain what kind of person you are. There is simply awareness without a profile. Third, time changes. Words create the sense of time passing. They mark before and after. They keep track. When words stop, time feels less segmented. Not like it disappears, more like it becomes softer. You're not constantly dividing the moment into smaller parts. You're not constantly placing it on a timeline. The moment feels whole, even if it's ordinary, especially if it's ordinary. This is not a trance. It's not an altered state. It's not a special condition you enter. It's just the natural baseline beneath constant narration. A quiet that was always available. It was just covered by speech. When words stop arriving, there can be a brief fear. A subtle panic that says, "Do something." This fear often comes from the mind's need to stay active. It believes that if it stops producing language, something will go wrong. But nothing goes wrong. In fact, the opposite happens. The system relaxes because the workload drops. There's no translation happening, no internal reporting, no constant processing. The body isn't being interpreted. The moment isn't being graded. Everything becomes simpler. One of the most surprising things that remains is competence. You can still do things without words. You can still navigate, still respond, still solve small problems, still speak when needed. The mind doesn't disappear. It just stops narrating continuously. Thought becomes occasional instead of constant, functional instead of compulsive. This reveals something important. Language was never the source of intelligence. It was one expression of intelligence. Intelligence also lives in sensation, in pattern recognition, in responsiveness, in memory, in the body's ability to adjust. When words stop arriving, that deeper intelligence becomes more visible. You trust it more, not because you decided to, because it proves itself. You reach for something without narrating it. You respond to someone's tone without labeling it. You sense what's needed without internal debate. This quiet competence. Another thing that remains is feeling, but feeling without words is different. It's less defined, less categorized. You don't call it anxiety or sadness right away. You just feel the energy, the contraction, the warmth, the heaviness. And without a label, it doesn't become a problem. It's just sensation moving through. This can change emotional life dramatically, because many emotions are intensified by naming. Not always, but often. When you label a feeling, you pull in associations, memories, interpretations, predictions. The label becomes a doorway to story. Without the label, the feeling stays local. It stays in the body. And because it stays local, it passes more easily. This doesn't mean you never name emotion again. It means naming becomes optional. You can name a feeling when useful, but you're not forced to. You're not required to narrate your inner state in order to survive it. When words stop arriving, you also notice the environment more clearly. Not because you're focusing harder, because attention isn't being pulled inward. You hear more, not in a heightened way, in a natural way, because you're actually listening. You notice small things, light on a wall, the way a room feels, the movement of people around you. And these observations don't turn into commentary. They remain simple. They come and go. This simplicity creates a kind of peace that doesn't feel like peace. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, "You are calm." It doesn't become an identity. It's just the absence of unnecessary inner speech. There's also a different relationship to silence. Silence becomes normal, not special, not spiritual, not rare. It's just what happens when words pause. And because it's normal, you don't chase it. You don't try to maintain it. You don't fear losing it. You let it come and go. This is important, because the moment you chase silence, you create noise. Chasing creates commentary. Maintaining creates tension. But when you allow words to stop naturally, there is no tension. There is no effort. It's just a pause in narration. And in that pause, something remains that is very hard to describe, because it exists before description. It's the sense of being, not as a concept, as a fact. You are here, not because you say so, because you are. This beingness is not dramatic. It doesn't feel like enlightenment. It feels like baseline reality, like gravity, like temperature, like the simple fact of existence. When words stop arriving, you also notice how often words were used to manage discomfort, to avoid, to escape, to distract. A constant inner monologue can be a form of hiding. Hiding from sensation, hiding from uncertainty, hiding from the rawness of the moment. When words pause, there's no hiding, but that rawness turns out to be manageable. It's not too much. The moment is not unbearable without narration. It's actually easier, because narration often added friction, created distance, created resistance. Without it, the moment is just the moment, and you are just here. This doesn't mean words disappear forever. They return when needed. They return when you speak, plan, solve, communicate. But they return differently, less compulsively, less continuously, more like tools. They arrive, do their job, and leave. And when they leave, what remains is steady. Not empty, steady. Sensation, presence, competence, being. A simple, wordless contact with life. This is the foundation beneath the narrator. The narrator was never the foundation. It was an overlay, a layer added on top of something already complete. When that layer thins, you don't fall into nothing. You fall into what was always here, and what was always here is enough. Life doesn't require constant inner speech to be lived. It requires availability. It requires contact. It requires being here. When words stop arriving, being here becomes obvious, not as an insight, as a fact. And from that fact, life continues, quietly, ordinarily, unannounced.